At my father's black tie birthday gala, my own brother signaled security to kick me out, shouting that I did not belong among their elite guests. The crowd stared with absolute contempt as guards grabbed my arms. Then the governor of our state stepped up to the microphone, looked around the glittering ballroom, and asked how my family could possibly be so blind. The entire room went dead silent. My brother went pale, completely paralyzed, as the governor revealed the massive secret I had been hiding for years. My name is Penelope, and I am 33 years old. For over a decade, I allowed my family to believe I was nothing more than a struggling nobody. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of a family who underestimated your worth. The grand ballroom of the Rhodes Plaza in Boston was dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with the city's most powerful politicians and socialites. It was my father Richard's 65th birthday gala, a milestone event designed to showcase our family's immense wealth and unyielding influence. I stood near the back of the room, keeping a quiet distance from the festivities. I wore a custom designer gown that cost more than most people make in an entire year, though its sleek black silk drew no attention. My parents assumed I was wearing a cheap knockoff from a discount store. They always assumed the worst of me. For my entire life, I was the designated scapegoat of the Rhodes family. While my older brother Bradley was treated like royalty and groomed to inherit the family empire, I was cast aside, criticized for my independence, and labeled a defiant disappointment. I had spent the last 10 years building my own life far away from their toxic control. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, a private equity and corporate crisis management firm in New York. I had built a massive fortune entirely on my own. Yet, my family firmly believed I was still barely scraping by as a low-level customer service representative. I never corrected them. The silence was my shield, allowing me to build my empire without their interference or greedy demands. I was sipping sparkling water when freezing liquid hit my right side. A full glass of heavy dark red wine soaked right through the pristine silk of my gown, blooming into a massive, undeniable stain. I looked up to see my sister-in-law Jasmine holding an empty crystal goblet. Jasmine was an African-American luxury lifestyle influencer who had married into the Rhodes family wealth 5 years ago. She was undeniably stunning, but her beauty masked a sharp, manipulative vanity. She thrived on social media validation and possessed an unrelenting need to assert superiority over me. Tonight, she wore a bright silver sequined dress and enough borrowed diamonds to fund a small city. She lived for this kind of attention. Instead of apologizing or offering a napkin, Jasmine let out a loud, theatrical laugh that echoed over the soft piano music playing in the background. Her laugh was designed to attract an audience, and it worked. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Watch your step, Penny. That cheap off-the-rack dress is completely ruined. What a massive shame. If you needed a free meal that badly, I could have hired you to serve hors d'oeuvres with the catering staff. You still answer phones for a living, right?" Several wealthy guests standing nearby turned to look, snickering behind their champagne flutes. I could feel their judgmental eyes scanning my ruined dress and silently agreeing with Jasmine's cruel assessment. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice once or show a single ounce of the humiliation she was desperately trying to provoke. I calmly took a white linen napkin from a passing waiter and dabbed at the ruined silk of my gown. "I did not come for the free food, Jasmine," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and loud enough for her eager audience to hear. "I came because my own mother sent me a generic automated email invite to fill a seat at the back of the room, so her family portraits would look complete for the press. Just like she did when she accidentally drained my entire college savings account to pay off the hush money for Bradley's hit-and-run settlement 10 years ago." The snickering from the surrounding guests abruptly stopped. Jasmine's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes widening as the hushed whispers rippled through the immediate crowd. Exposing the wealthy family's dirty laundry at a high-profile corporate event was the ultimate sin in the Rhodes family playbook. But I was no longer the frightened teenager they could bully into submission. I stared back at her, refusing to break eye contact, waiting for her next move. Before Jasmine could formulate a response, heavy, aggressive footsteps approached from behind her. My brother Bradley stormed over, his face flushed red with unhinged anger. As the executive vice president of Rhodes Luxury Resorts, Bradley walked around the hotel like a reigning king, despite lacking the actual business acumen to run a simple lemonade stand. He had coasted through life on our parents' money and unearned promotions, projecting an image of a brilliant businessman while secretly bearing the company in catastrophic debt. He positioned himself squarely between me and his wife, puffing out his chest to intimidate me. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin through the wet silk. "How dare you disrespect my wife and bring up the past today?" Bradley hissed, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. "This is Dad's 65th birthday gala. You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, eating our food and insulting Jasmine. You do not belong here among real successful people. You never have." I looked down at his hand, gripping my arm, a surge of absolute disgust washing over me, then looked back up to his furious, bloodshot eyes. "Let go of me, Bradley," I said evenly, offering no outward reaction to his physical intimidation. He scoffed, dropping my arm as if touching me disgusted him, wiping his hand on his tailored tuxedo trousers. "You are a failure, Penelope. You have always been a bitter, jealous failure who resents everything I have built and everything Jasmine has. You contribute nothing to this family but embarrassment." He turned his head and raised his hand sharply in the air. "Security!" he yelled, his voice carrying over the chatter of the room. "Get this woman out of my hotel immediately!" Two massive security guards in dark, tailored suits immediately broke through the crowd, marching directly toward me with grim expressions. They flanked my sides, each grabbing one of my arms with professional, ruthless efficiency. "Wait! Let go of me!" I demanded, planting my feet firmly on the polished marble floor, refusing to make it easy for them. Bradley just smiled, adjusting his jacket cuffs, clearly reveling in the power trip. "Escort her out through the service elevator in the back," he instructed the guards, waving his hand dismissively. "We do not want her making a pathetic scene in the main lobby and disturbing the important guests." The attendees watched the spectacle with thinly veiled amusement, perfectly content to see the family outcast publicly humiliated and dragged away like a common criminal. I caught sight of my mother Patricia standing just a few feet away, near the extravagant dessert table. She was sipping her drink and watching me get manhandled by security without saying a single word to stop them. She simply turned her head away, pretending she did not know me. The guards pulled me forward, my heels dragging against the floor as they forcefully marched me toward the kitchen corridors. I prepared to brace myself, my mind racing as I calculated the exact moment to play the devastating card I held in my pocket. I knew exactly what I was going to do. But before I could speak a single word, a loud, piercing screech of microphone feedback erupted through the ballroom's massive surround sound system. The harsh noise silenced the soft piano music and halted the security guards dead in their tracks. A booming, incredibly authoritative voice echoed across the silent room, commanding absolute obedience. "Take your hands off my guest immediately." Every single head in the room, including Bradley and Jasmine's, snapped toward the main stage. Standing behind the polished glass podium, tightly gripping the microphone, was Governor Mitchell Davis. He was the most powerful political figure in the state, the man my father had been desperately trying to impress and court all evening to secure crucial zoning permits. The governor was glaring directly at Bradley and the two security guards holding my arms, his face practically vibrating with intense, unyielding fury. Governor Mitchell Davis strode down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted for him instantly. He did not look at the wealthy donors or the politicians attempting to catch his eye. His gaze was locked entirely on the two security guards gripping my arms. The heavy silence in the room amplified the sharp clack of his dress shoes against the marble floor. Bradley froze. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, frantic confusion. The security guards hesitated, their grips loosening as they recognized the most powerful man in the state bearing down on them. "I said, take your hands off her," the governor repeated. His voice did not require a microphone this time to command absolute authority. He swatted the guard's hands away from my arms with a sharp, dismissive gesture. The guard stepped back immediately, retreating into the shadows of the ballroom. Bradley stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. A nervous, glistening sweat broke out on his forehead. Governor Davis Bradley stammered, his voice pitching higher than usual. "There is a massive misunderstanding here. I apologize for the disruption. She is just my estranged sister. She is a complete failure who showed up uninvited to cause trouble. We were simply escorting her out so she would not bother important people like you." The governor stopped right beside me. He turned slowly to look at Bradley. The expression on the governor's face was one of absolute, unadulterated disgust. He looked at my brother as if Bradley were a stain on the bottom of his shoe. "You really do not know who she is?" Governor Davis asked. His voice sliced through the tension, cold and sharp. The room went dead silent. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased. The wealthy socialites and business moguls leaned in, hanging on every single word. Jasmine, who had been sneering at me just moments before, clutched her diamond necklace, her eyes darting nervously between the governor and her husband. "She is Penelope Rhodes," the governor announced, turning his gaze to the crowd to ensure every single person in the ballroom heard him clearly. "Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The name Apex Holdings carried massive weight in this room. It was the ruthless, invisible giant of the financial district, the firm that bought out failing corporations and stripped them down to the studs. I had spent years hiding my identity behind corporate shields and board members precisely for this reason. I wanted to build my empire without the Rhodes name attached to it. Bradley scoffed, shaking his head in frantic denial. "No, Governor, you are confused. Penny is a receptionist. She answers phones. She is the one who just bailed out our state pension fund with a $100 million injection," the governor continued, completely ignoring Bradley's pathetic interruption. "She saved thousands of state jobs last week. She is the VIP guest of honor I was waiting for to arrive tonight. And you, Bradley, just instructed your security guards to drag her out of a ballroom like a criminal." Bradley took a physical step back as if he had been struck. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him pale and completely speechless. Jasmine stood frozen, her jaw hanging slightly open as she stared at the red wine stain she had intentionally spilled on my custom gown. The realization that she had just assaulted the most powerful woman in the room was visibly crushing her fragile ego. Suddenly, the sharp click of sensible heels cut through the silence. My mother, Patricia, rushed forward from the dessert table. Her face was flushed a vibrant, angry red. She could not stand the idea of her carefully curated narrative falling apart in front of Boston's elite. For years, she had fed her high society friends a fabricated story to explain my absence, painting me as a troubled, ungrateful burden to preserve her image as the perfect mother. "Governor Davis," Patricia said, forcing a bright, painfully fake smile onto her face. She stepped between me and the governor, physically attempting to block me from his view. "You must be mistaken. I know my own daughter. Penny dropped out of her master's program years ago. She was entirely unmanageable. We had to cut her off financially because she stubbornly refused to work under her brother at the family company. She is prone to these grand delusions, Governor. She probably lied to your office to gain access to this party." Patricia reached out, attempting to grab my wrist with her manicured hand. I took a deliberate step back, refusing to let her touch me. "I did not drop out, Mom," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the hushed ballroom. I looked her directly in the eyes, watching the panic flare behind her expensive makeup. "I transferred to Wharton on a full academic scholarship. I had to get a scholarship because you flatly refused to co-sign my student loan. You claimed the family trust was entirely tied up in illiquid assets, yet strangely enough you managed to buy Bradley a $2 million yacht that exact same week." Whispers erupted immediately among the guests. Several prominent board members of Rhodes Resorts exchanged dark, concerning looks. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her perfect loving mother facade was cracking publicly, exposing the toxic favoritism she had weaponized against me my entire life. And as for working under Bradley, I continued turning my attention to my brother, who was sweating profusely through his tailored collar. Why would I ever take orders from a man who cannot even balance his own personal checking account? Apex Holdings is my company. I built it from the ground up, while you were busy spending Dad's money on country club memberships and public relations firms to hide your sheer incompetence. Bradley's hands balled into tight fists at his sides. His entire identity was built on the delusion that he was a self-made business prodigy. Having his younger sister, the family scapegoat, publicly expose his total reliance on our parents' wealth was destroying him. He looked around the room, desperate to regain control of the narrative, desperate to make me small again. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that sounded incredibly forced and hysterical. He clapped his hands together, stepping toward the center of the crowd to draw their attention back to him. "A fake company," Bradley yelled, projecting his voice to the furthest corners of the ballroom. "Please, Penelope, you expect these brilliant investors to believe you secretly run a billion-dollar private equity firm? You are wearing a wine-stained dress and throwing a temper tantrum at our father's birthday party. If you are so incredibly rich and powerful, Penny, why are you really here?" He walked over to Jasmine, wrapping his arm around her waist and pulling her close to project an image of a united, powerful couple. Jasmine quickly adjusted her posture, pasting a haughty sneer back onto her face, eager to ride Bradley's coattails back to safety. "I will tell you why she is here," Bradley announced to the crowd, pointing a finger directly at me. "She is jealous. She knows exactly what tonight is. If you are a titan of industry, Penny, why is Dad about to announce that I am taking over as the sole chief executive officer of Rhodes Resorts, a $500 million empire? You are just throwing this pathetic, elaborate lie together to steal my spotlight because you know you get nothing." I watched him perform his desperate little dance. He was so incredibly predictable. Every single time his fragile ego was threatened, he hid behind our father's money and the grand illusion of the Rhodes family legacy. He truly believed that becoming the CEO of Rhodes Resorts made him untouchable. He believed that piece of paper made him a king. I looked past Bradley and locked eyes with my father, Richard. He had been standing near the main stage this entire time, watching the confrontation unfold with cold, calculating eyes. Richard was a narcissist who only valued people based on their net worth and their ability to elevate his own social standing. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. He was a ruthless businessman, and he recognized the absolute certainty in the governor's voice. He knew the governor would not risk his political career to defend a random nobody. But Richard's pride was his ultimate weakness. He had spent his entire life building the myth that his son was a genius. Admitting that he was wrong, admitting that his despised daughter had surpassed his golden boy, was a psychological impossibility for him. He had to double down. He had to protect the empire's image at all costs. Richard straightened his tuxedo jacket, projecting his chest outward, and marched directly up the stairs to the main stage. He approached the microphone stand, his face set in a hard, uncompromising glare. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thuds commanding the room's attention away from the conflict on the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his deep voice rolling over the murmuring crowd, "I apologize for this unfortunate familial disruption, but we will not allow delusions and jealousy to derail the celebration of our company's glorious future." He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward to deliver the final crushing blow he had planned for me all along. The announcement that was supposed to solidify my status as the permanent loser of the Rhodes family. Bradley smirked at me, his chest heaving with arrogant triumph. Jasmine crossed her arms, looking at me with profound pity. They thought they had won. They thought this was the end of the line for me. I stood perfectly still, the wet silk of my gown clinging to my side, and waited for my father to speak the words that would trigger the trap I had spent the last 3 months carefully constructing. My father cleared his throat loudly, the sound echoing through the grand ballroom and drowning out the low hum of whispered conversations. He gripped the edges of the crystal podium so tightly his knuckles turned a stark white. Richard Rhodes was a man whose entire existence depended on controlling the narrative. Faced with the undeniable reality that his outcast daughter was standing in his ballroom as a billionaire savior of the state economy, he chose the only path his fragile ego would allow. He chose absolute aggressive denial. He looked directly over Governor Davis, refusing to acknowledge the most powerful man in the room, and locked his cold gaze onto me. The sheer audacity of his pride was almost impressive. He was staring at a woman who wielded enough financial power to crush his entire legacy with a single phone call. Yet he still saw only the disobedient teenager he had banished from his home. "Tonight is not about fairy tales or desperate cries for attention," my father announced into the microphone. His voice dripped with practiced condescension. "Tonight is about the future of the Rhodes legacy. For decades, I have built an empire of luxury, setting the gold standard for hospitality across the eastern seaboard. An empire of this magnitude requires a leader with vision, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. It requires a true heir who understands the weight of our family name." He paused dramatically, gesturing broadly toward the center of the room where Bradley stood. Bradley immediately straightened his posture, puffing out his chest and smoothing the lapels of his custom tuxedo. He plastered on a sickeningly arrogant smile, entirely willing to play his part in our father's delusion. Bradley had spent his entire life taking credit for the hard work of others, and tonight was going to be his ultimate coronation. That is why, effective immediately, I am officially stepping down and naming my son, Bradley Rhodes, as the sole chief executive officer and exclusive heir to Rhodes Resorts, my father declared proudly. The ballroom remained awkwardly silent, save for a few confused claps from loyal board members, who were too terrified to read the shifting power dynamics in the room. The tension was palpable. The air felt heavy, charged with the electric anticipation of a storm about to break. My father leaned closer to the microphone, his eyes narrowing as he glared directly at me. I felt the collective stare of hundreds of guests burning into my skin, waiting to see if I would shatter under the weight of his public rejection. "We only invest in winners," Richard sneered loudly, making absolutely sure the vicious insult carried to the very back of the massive room. "We do not entertain imposters or reward rebellion. The future of this company belongs to the strong." Before the last syllable even left his mouth, Jasmine erupted into a loud theatrical applause. She clapped her hands together with exaggerated enthusiasm, making absolutely sure the heavy Cartier diamond rings on her fingers caught the light from the chandeliers above. She stepped forward, leaving Bradley's side to stand just a few feet away from me. Her silver sequined dress shimmered as she moved, a walking advertisement for the wealth she desperately claimed as her own. "Hear that, Penny?" Jasmine asked, her voice shrill and echoing in the quiet room. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Maybe Bradley will be generous enough to give you a job cleaning the lobby. We do own this building after all. You should probably start looking for a mop instead of standing around making up stories to impress the governor." She tossed her hair over her shoulder, letting out a self-satisfied little laugh. She fully expected me to break down in tears, to scream loudly, or to run out of the ballroom in complete shame. That was the dynamic they had relied on for 30 years. They pushed, and I retreated. They insulted, and I stayed silent. They thrived on making me feel incredibly small so they could feel incredibly large. But I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply reached into the pocket of my ruined silk gown and pulled out my phone. I kept my eyes locked on Bradley, ignoring Jasmine completely. The audiovisual team running the technical production for the gala had been contracted through a third-party vendor. What my father and brother did not know was that Apex Holdings had acquired that specific vendor 2 years ago. I had unrestricted access to every digital system in the Rhodes Plaza. The trap was set perfectly primed and waiting for this exact moment. I swiped across my screen and tapped a single button. A loud electronic chime echoed through the sound system, overriding my father's microphone. The massive high-definition projector screens hanging on the walls behind the main stage flickered violently. The slideshow of my father's career achievements abruptly vanished, replaced by a glaringly bright, high-contrast spreadsheet. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, projecting my voice so it carried clearly across the vast space without needing a microphone. "Are you entirely sure you want to inherit this company tonight, Bradley?" I asked, my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "Because I highly recommend you look at the screens behind you before you accept that title." Bradley frowned, his arrogant smile faltering as he turned around. My father spun around at the podium, his face draining of color as he stared at the massive digital display. "Because as of exactly 4 o'clock this very afternoon, Rhodes Resorts has exactly $432 in its primary operating account," I stated clearly. The entire ballroom immediately erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps. The wealthy investors, the politicians, and the elite socialites surged forward, squinting to read the glowing numbers projected in massive font. The document displayed on the screens was a redacted but undeniably official financial summary of the Rhodes Resort's corporate accounts. It showed a devastating cascade of red numbers, plummeting profit margins, maxed out corporate credit lines, and a final undeniable balance of $432. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of a $500 million illusion shattering in real time. The investors in the room, men and women who had poured millions into my father's expansion projects over the last decade, began whispering frantically to one another. Cell phones were rapidly pulled out of pockets and evening bags. Panic began to spread like a highly contagious virus through the crowd. I could see the realization dawning on the faces of the board members sitting at the VIP tables. Bradley stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, staring at the screens with his mouth hanging open. His hands trembled visibly against his sides. The golden child, the brilliant business prodigy who had been handed every single advantage in life, had been completely and publicly stripped of his armor. He looked exactly like the incompetent, terrified little boy he had always been beneath the expensive tailored suits. "Turn it off!" My father roared, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. He slammed his hand against the glass podium, pointing wildly at the audio-visual booth in the back of the room. "Turn those screens off right now. This is a malicious cyber attack. She hacked our secure systems with fake documents." He scrambled down the stage steps, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as he rushed toward me. He looked frantic, his eyes wide and wild. "She is lying to you all. It is a fabricated spreadsheet designed to ruin my birthday gala. My company is thriving. We are generating record profits every single quarter." Jasmine, however, was not looking at the screens. She was looking at Bradley, and the panic in her eyes was entirely genuine. The reality of the situation was hitting her with the force of a freight train. If the company was truly bankrupt, her entire identity was gone forever. Her elite social status, her millions of internet followers, her lavish lifestyle, all rested entirely on the foundation of Bradley's supposedly limitless bank accounts. Without his money, she was absolutely nothing in this room. "Bradley, what is she talking about?" Jasmine demanded, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch that cut through the murmuring crowd. She grabbed his arm, shaking him violently when he refused to look away from the projected numbers. "Tell them she is lying to us. Tell them we are rich. You just bought me a $2 million villa in Aspen yesterday. You showed me the official deed. We are closing on it tomorrow morning." The crowd went dead silent once again, hanging on to every single word of Jasmine's frantic, desperate confession. The investors exchanged highly suspicious glances, mentally calculating the impossibility of a multi-million-dollar real estate purchase, alongside the devastated corporate accounts displayed brightly on the wall. I smiled, letting the cold, hard reality of my words sink deep into the room before I delivered the final crushing blow. The moment I had worked toward for an entire decade had finally arrived. "He did not buy it, Jasmine," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating tension like a perfectly sharpened blade. I looked directly into her terrified, widening eyes, watching the absolute horror dawn on her perfectly contoured face. "He embezzled it right out from under you. He embezzled it right out from under you." The words hung in the chilled air of the ballroom like a physical weight. Jasmine physically recoiled. She stumbled back a half step, the sharp heels of her designer shoes catching slightly on the polished marble floor. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone trembled violently as her breathing turned shallow and rapid. She stared at me, her perfectly manicured hands dropping to her sides. For the first time in the 10 years I had known my sister-in-law, she was entirely speechless. Her brain was clearly struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the accusation I had just leveled against her husband. She looked up at the massive projector screens displaying the bankrupt operating accounts, then snapped her gaze toward Bradley. Bradley refused to look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, his face shining with a sickly layer of cold sweat. His silence was the most damning confession possible. But Jasmine was not the type of woman to go down quietly. Her entire life, her entire identity was built on projecting an image of flawless luxury and untouchable wealth to her millions of internet followers. The realization that her opulent lifestyle was a fragile house of cards was too much for her ego to accept. She had to fight back. She had to protect her brand. The shock on her face rapidly hardened into a mask of pure, vicious rage. "You are a liar!" Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She marched forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a disgusting, manipulative liar. You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life with some fake spreadsheets you mocked up on your computer? My lifestyle is funded by my own brand deals and my husband's legitimate wealth. I work incredibly hard for everything I have. I built a lifestyle empire. Bradley is a brilliant executive who provides for his family exactly the way a real man should. You are just a jealous, bitter spinster trying to drag us down to your pathetic level because you cannot get a man to look twice at you." The sheer audacity of her statement caused a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs to spread through the crowd. The wealthy socialites and powerful politicians surrounding us were watching a high society implosion play out in real time. Jasmine stood there, chest heaving, desperately waiting for me to shrink away under her verbal assault. She expected me to lower my head and absorb the insults just as I had done when we were younger. Instead, I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a trap. I tapped the screen of my phone once. "Jealous?" I asked, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the room. "Are you referring to the same type of jealousy you displayed 5 years ago, when Dad gave you the vintage sapphire heirloom necklace that belonged to my late grandmother, the one that was explicitly willed to me? You threw a massive tantrum 3 days before your wedding, crying that the bride needed it more than the outcast sister. You demanded it, and Dad took it right out of my hands to keep the peace and keep you happy. You have always believed you are entitled to things that do not belong to you, Jasmine. So let us take a very close look at this legitimate wealth you are so incredibly proud of." The giant projector screens behind my father flashed instantly, swapping the bankrupt operating account for a highly detailed, heavily redacted wire transfer log. The document was a glaring testament to corporate fraud stamped with official banking seals and tracking numbers that no one could possibly fake. I turned to face the crowd, specifically targeting the board members and investors seated at the front tables. I wanted them to see exactly who they had trusted with their money. "What you are looking at on the screen behind me is the transaction history for the Rhodes Resorts Staff Pension Fund," I announced. My voice was steady, carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "This account holds the retirement savings of the maids, the concierges, the maintenance staff, and the kitchen workers who have dedicated 20, sometimes 30 years of their lives to keeping this hotel running. It was meant to secure their futures." I paused, letting the severity of my words sink into the room. I could see the catering staff standing near the edges of the ballroom freeze. Waiters carrying trays of champagne stopped dead in their tracks, their faces paling as they looked up at the screens. "As of last Tuesday, that pension fund has been completely drained," I stated. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The atmosphere shifted from scandalous amusement to absolute outrage. Stealing from investors was bad enough in this circle, but stealing the retirement funds of blue-collar workers was a crime that invited federal investigations and severe prison sentences. The board members at the VIP tables looked physically ill. Some were already reaching for their cell phones, likely calling their own legal teams to distance themselves from the impending fallout. But where did all those millions go? I continued pacing slowly across the open floor to ensure every eye was fixed on the undeniable evidence. They did not go toward hotel renovations. They did not go toward paying down corporate debt. I pointed directly at the highlighted section of the wire transfer log. They went through a series of offshore shell companies before landing directly into an account registered to Jasmine Lux LLC. That is your primary holding company for your influencer brand, is it not, Jasmine? The silence that followed was deafening. The screen clearly showed a final transfer of $2.4 million into Jasmine's personal business account. It was the exact amount needed to purchase the Aspen villa she had been bragging about just moments earlier. The proof was absolute, undeniable, and currently being projected in high definition for the governor and the state's most powerful people to see. Jasmine's face lost all of its color. The haughty, aggressive energy she had displayed just seconds ago vanished completely. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looked harsh and mask-like against her chalk-white skin. She stared at the screen, reading the name of her own LLC linked directly to stolen pension funds. The legal implications crashed down on her all at once. She was officially an accessory to massive corporate embezzlement. The guests in the room began murmuring angrily. The whispers turned into hostile glares directed right at Bradley and Jasmine. The elite society that my family had fought so desperately to impress was turning on them in an instant. Jasmine spun around to face Bradley. She did not defend him. She did not stand by her husband in his darkest moment. The illusion of their perfect marriage shattered the second her own freedom was threatened. "Bradley, what did you do?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice frantic and laced with absolute terror. She grabbed his tuxedo jacket, shaking him. "You told me that was a tax loophole. You said your accountants figured out a way to route brand sponsorships through a corporate entity to save on capital gains. You never told me it was stolen from the staff. You put my name on a stolen account." Bradley tried to shush her, grabbing her wrist to stop her from making a scene, but the damage was already done. The marital alliance was dead. They were turning on each other exactly like rats trapped in a sinking ship. My father Richard stood at the podium looking utterly defeated. His legacy, his wealth, and his reputation were evaporating right in front of his eyes. He realized that if the governor and the investors left this room believing these documents, he would spend the rest of his life fighting federal indictments. He had to stop me. He had to silence the presentation immediately. Desperation completely overrode his common sense. He abandoned the microphone and rushed down the steps of the stage, his face contorted with panic and fury. He waved his arms wildly toward the security guards who were still hovering near the kitchen doors. "Arrest her!" Richard commanded, his voice raw and screaming. "Do not just stand there. Call the police immediately. She is trespassing on private property. She has hacked into our highly secure corporate servers and is projecting falsified documents to terrorize my guests. She is committing corporate espionage right in front of the governor. Arrest her now." The security guards hesitated, clearly unsure if they had the authority to detain a woman who had just been publicly defended by the governor of the state. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting to see how I would react to my father's ultimate threat of law enforcement. I simply locked my phone, slipping it back into the pocket of my silk gown. I stood tall in the center of the room, completely unbothered by his desperate screaming. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked at my father with a calm, freezing smile. "Please call them," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic murmuring of the crowd. In fact, I already did. The faint wail of sirens began to echo from the streets of downtown Boston. The sound rapidly multiplied, growing louder and more intense by the second, until the flashing red and blue lights painted the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the grand ballroom. My father Richard let out a harsh, triumphant breath. He adjusted his posture, his chest puffing out as the familiar arrogance washed right back over his face. He truly believed he had won. He believed that the ultimate authority figures had arrived to sweep away the problem child who dared to challenge his kingdom. Bradley stood a little taller, wiping the nervous sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He shot a smug, vicious look in my direction, completely convinced that my downfall was imminent. "Look at what you have done to yourself, Penelope," Richard sneered, his voice dropping to a menacingly low register. "You just could not leave well enough alone. You could not accept your place in this family. Now you are going to leave my birthday gala in handcuffs, and I will personally make sure the district attorney prosecutes you to the fullest extent of the law. You are finished in this town." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. A team of uniformed police officers marched into the room, their expressions grim and strictly professional. But they were not alone. Flanking the local police were several men and women dressed in sharp, unassuming dark suits, their federal badges clearly visible. These were investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The heavy clatter of their footsteps against the marble floor sent a secondary shockwave of absolute terror through the elite crowd. You could practically smell the fear radiating from the investors and board members. Seeing federal agents raid a high society corporate gala was the ultimate nightmare for everyone in that room. The crowd scrambled backward, parting like the Red Sea to create a wide, clear path for the authorities. Bradley did not waste a single second. He practically sprinted across the dance floor to intercept the lead officer, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at me. "Officers, thank God you are here!" Bradley shouted, projecting his voice to sound like the victimized executive in charge. "Arrest my sister immediately. She is completely unhinged. She is trespassing on private property, disrupting a private corporate event, and projecting falsified corporate documents onto our screens. She hacked our internal servers. I want her removed from my hotel right now." Bradley stood aside, crossing his arms, fully expecting the officers to draw their weapons. Tackle me to the ground and drag me out through the service elevator, just as his own security guards had attempted earlier. He wore a sickeningly eager smile, anticipating my total humiliation. The lead officer, a tall, imposing man with graying hair, did not even break his stride. He did not acknowledge Bradley. He did not look at my father. He walked straight past my brother as if Bradley were nothing more than a minor obstruction on the floor. Bradley's smug smile evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of profound, agonizing confusion. He reached out, opening his mouth to issue another demand, but one of the federal agents stepped into his path, giving him a cold, hard glare that silenced him immediately. The lead officer stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The entire ballroom held its breath. The silence was so absolute that the hum of the massive projector screens above us sounded like a roaring engine. The officer reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, meticulously bound black leather folder. He extended it toward me with a sharp nod of profound professional respect. "As requested, Ms. Rhodes," the officer stated, his voice carrying easily through the dead silent room. "The premises have been entirely secured. Our agents are currently locking down the executive offices on the top floor and freezing all remaining corporate assets. No one will be allowed to remove a single physical or digital file from this building without your direct authorization." I took the leather folder from his hands, the smooth, cool texture grounding me in the reality of my absolute victory. "Thank you, officer," I replied calmly. "Your swift response is greatly appreciated." I turned slowly, holding the folder in my hands, and locked eyes with my father. Richard looked as if the marble floor had just dropped out from underneath his feet. His mouth hung open, his eyes darting frantically between the federal agents, the police officers, and the leather folder I held. Bradley was hyperventilating his hands, pulling at his own hair as his brain completely failed to process what he was witnessing. Jasmine was leaning heavily against a cocktail table, looking physically ill. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. "What are you doing?" "I am the CEO of Rhodes Resorts. I am the owner of this building. I demand an explanation right now." I slowly untied the string holding the folder closed and flipped it open, revealing the heavily stamped, legally binding foreclosure documents. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The raw power of the truth was enough to dominate the room. "I am not trespassing, Dad," I said, every single syllable crisp and perfectly articulated. "And you do not own this building anymore." 3 weeks ago, Rhodes Resorts officially defaulted on its massive $300 million debt to your private offshore lenders. Richard physically recoiled. The investors sitting at the VIP tables erupted into a frenzy of panicked whispers. Defaulting on a debt of that magnitude was the equivalent of financial suicide. The board members, who had been completely kept in the dark about the severity of the company's financial ruin, glared furiously at my father. You hid that default behind shell companies and creative accounting, hoping you could secure the new zoning permits tonight to borrow even more money to cover your tracks. I continued methodically exposing the fraudulent foundation of his entire life. But private lenders are not as forgiving as commercial banks. When you missed your final grace period, they immediately auctioned off your debt to the highest bidder in a private closed-door sale. Bradley shook his head rapidly, stumbling forward. No, 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 that is impossible. We had an extension. We had an agreement. You had an illusion, Bradley. I snapped back, shutting him down instantly. You had a handshake deal with criminals who dumped your toxic debt the second they realized you were actively embezzling from the staff pension fund to buy real estate for your wife. I turned my attention back to my father, who was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He finally realized the scope of the trap I had built. He realized that the daughter he had thrown away had quietly orchestrated his total destruction. Apex Holdings bought your debt, Dad, I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. My company bought your $300 million disaster for absolute pennies on the dollar. You have been running a bankrupt empire, and I have been holding the leash for 3 entire weeks. I executed the final foreclosure clause exactly 1 hour ago, right before you tried to have me physically dragged out of this room. I closed the leather folder with a sharp, echoing snap. I do not just own your debt, I said, taking one deliberate step toward him. I own this entire hotel. I own the corporate offices upstairs. I own the brand name you value more than your own children. I own this ballroom. You are standing on my property. The absolute devastation that washed over Richard Rhodes was a sight I will remember for the rest of my life. His knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of the glass podium to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The powerful, terrifying titan of industry who had tormented me for 30 years was gone. In his place stood a broken, bankrupt fraud who had just been publicly stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. Bradley let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He looked at the federal agents securing the exits, then looked at the furious investors who were now actively dialing their high-powered attorneys. He knew his life as a wealthy playboy was over. He was going to federal prison for embezzlement, and there was absolutely nothing our father could do to save him. The silence that blanketed the room was total. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an empire collapsing into dust. I stood in the center of the ruin I had orchestrated, feeling no guilt, no remorse, and no hesitation. I had simply returned the exact energy they had given me my entire life. Suddenly, a loud, theatrical sob shattered the quiet. I turned to see my mother, Patricia, rushing forward. Her face was streaked with dramatic, perfectly timed tears. She pushed past a stunned board member, her hands reaching out toward me as if she were racing to embrace a long-lost hero. The venom and disgust she had displayed just minutes ago when she tried to cover up my Wharton scholarship were completely gone. In their place was a look of overwhelming manufactured maternal pride. Patricia practically threw herself in my direction, her arms wide open, a brilliant teary smile plastered across her face. "Oh, my sweet girl!" Patricia cried out, her voice loud and incredibly shrill, ensuring that the governor and every single investor in the room could hear her sudden change of heart. "I knew it. I always knew you were brilliant. You did all of this for us. You bought the family business to save us from this horrible financial mess, didn't you?" She stopped just a few feet away from me, clasping her hands together against her chest in a gesture of pure angelic gratitude. Her diamond bracelets clinked together. She looked at me with an expression of such intense manufactured love that it actually made my stomach turn. She was the ultimate chameleon. The moment she realized the power and the money had shifted from her husband and her golden boy son directly to the daughter she had spent decades abusing, she seamlessly rewrote her own reality. She was entirely ready to throw Richard and Bradley to the wolves if it meant she could retain her status and her access to wealth by clinging to my coattails. I looked at the woman who had watched me get dragged by security, the woman who had drained my college savings to protect a criminal, the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely unlovable. She honestly believed that her title as my mother would act as a universal shield against the consequences of her own actions. She believed I was still the desperate little girl craving her affection, willing to hand over my empire just to earn a fake smile and a pat on the head. I shifted my weight and took a smooth, deliberate step to the left. Patricia lunged forward, her arms closing around empty air. She stumbled in her heavy designer heels, her hands slapping against the polished glass of the speaker podium to stop herself from hitting the floor. The sudden awkward movement completely shattered her manufactured maternal performance. She looked ridiculous bent over the podium in her expensive gown, grasping at a daughter she did not even know. Patricia spun around to face me, her eyes flashing with genuine malice before she quickly forced the tearful, loving expression back onto her face. She was a master manipulator, and she knew the federal agents and the stunned investors were watching her every move. She had to secure her position on the winning team. "Penelope, darling, how can you be so cold?" Patricia cried out, placing a dramatic hand over her heart and looking around the room to garner sympathy. "We were just tough on you to build your character. Everything your father and I did was to push you to achieve your true potential. Look at you now, a billionaire. You see, our parenting worked. And because we are family, I know you are going to do the right thing. You are going to clear your brother's debt, reinstate the corporate accounts, and let him keep his CEO title right. It is what family does. Penny, we protect each other." I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The years of craving her approval had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, impenetrable armor. "Family?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low, but carrying enough volume to cut through the quiet room. "You want to talk about how this family protects each other, like when I had severe pneumonia at age 16. I was running a dangerous fever, completely delirious, hallucinating in my bedroom, and you left me completely alone in that massive house for an entire week. You packed your bags and took Bradley on a luxury ski trip to Switzerland because he claimed he was stressed and needed to decompress after failing a high school biology exam." I took a step closer to her, watching her shrink back against the glass podium. "I crawled down the stairs to heat up canned broth while you were ordering room service in the Alps." I continued, my voice entirely steady. "You did not even call to see if I was still breathing. You left a sick child alone to cater to a spoiled teenager. Do not stand in my ballroom and pretend you molded me into a success. You starved me of basic human care, and I survived entirely in spite of you." Patricia let out a loud, theatrical wail, burying her face in her hands. She peeked through her fingers to check if the wealthy donors were buying her performance. "You are twisting the past," she sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandeliers. "You were always prone to these terrible exaggerations. You have always been so vindictive, so determined to paint your own mother as a monster. Do not listen to her, Richard. She is having a mental break." I did not waste a single breath arguing with her. I simply looked past her, lifting my gaze to the sound booth at the very back of the ballroom. I gave the audio-visual technician a single sharp nod. A harsh crackle of static hissed through the surround sound speakers, immediately silencing Patricia's fake sobbing. The static cleared, replaced by a crisp, undeniably clear audio recording. It was a phone call captured during my team's extensive forensic audit of the Rhodes Resort's communications servers. "Just forge the old man's signature." Bradley's voice echoed through the ballroom. He sounded arrogant, reckless, and incredibly impatient. A second voice, rough and gravelly, answered back over the speakers. "I do not know, kid. Richard Rhodes is a heavy hitter. If this goes sideways, putting his private estate up as collateral is going to trigger a massive legal headache. You sure you have the authority to bypass the board?" "I am the executive vice president," Bradley's recorded voice snapped, dripping with entitled irritation. "I practically run the entire show. He is too busy playing golf and courting politicians to check the asset ledgers. Just forge the signature on the deed transfer. put his private estate up as collateral to secure the loan. He will not notice a single thing until I flip the Aspen property and replace the funds. Just get me the cash by Tuesday, or the pension fund audit is going to expose me." The audio clicked off, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The federal investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately exchanged sharp professional glances. They had just been handed a recorded confession to felony wire fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. One of the agents reached up to quietly speak into his radio earpiece. The walls were rapidly closing in on the Rhodes Empire. Richard staggered backward, as if he had been shot directly in the chest. His hands flew up, clutching the lapels of his tuxedo directly over his heart. He gasped for air, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. The ultimate narcissist had just discovered that his own golden child had betrayed him in the most profound, devastating way imaginable. His personal estate, his sanctuary, the sprawling mansion that cemented his status among Boston's ultra-elite, had been secretly mortgaged to illegal loan sharks to cover his son's catastrophic failures. "You forged my signature," Richard wheezed, his eyes bulging as he stared at his son in absolute horror. "You put my personal home on the line, my house." Bradley was completely trapped. The federal investigators stepped forward, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts, viewing him as a severe flight risk. The local police officers moved to secure the perimeter of the dance floor. The wealthy investors, who had once patted Bradley on the back and praised his business acumen, were now staring at him like he was a highly contagious disease. Jasmine had backed away from him entirely, pressing herself into the crowd to avoid being associated with his radioactive downfall. There was nowhere to run. There were no corporate lawyers left to bail him out. The trust fund was empty, and the bank accounts were frozen. The sheer absolute terror of being cornered finally broke Bradley. The polished golden child facade he had worn for 30 years disintegrated entirely, leaving behind a vicious, terrified coward. His shoulders hunched, his face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer, and he turned on our father with a level of pure venom I had never seen before. "You are a washed-up old man," Dad, Bradley screamed, spit flying from his lips as he aggressively stepped toward Richard. "Do not act like you are the victim here. You sat in your exclusive country clubs pretending we were invincible while the resort revenues tanked. You spent millions on your own public relations campaigns and custom suits, while we could barely cover corporate payroll. Someone had to keep the lights on. Someone had to find the cash." Bradley pointed a shaking finger at Richard's chest, his voice echoing frantically. "I had to do it to keep this family looking rich because you were too blind and too arrogant to see we were already drowning. I was trying to save your pathetic legacy." Richard looked absolutely shattered. The son he had worshipped, the boy he had elevated above everyone else, the heir he had just crowned as the future of the company, was publicly calling him a failure and admitting to massive corporate fraud. Richard's eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the federal agents writing in their notepads, the disgusted investors murmuring to one another, and his entirely ruined legacy broadcast for the world to see. He was entirely desperate. He was a drowning man searching for a life raft in a sea of sharks. Slowly, Richard turned his frantic, pleading eyes away from his treacherous son and locked them directly onto me. He took a stumbling step in my direction, his hands trembling as he reached out, preparing to offer me a truly shocking proposal. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving rapidly as the reality of his total ruin finally pierced his massive, impenetrable ego. He looked over his shoulder at Bradley, his golden boy, the son he had meticulously groomed to inherit an empire, and his expression hardened into pure, calculating ice. The paternal pride vanished in a microsecond, replaced entirely by the ruthless survival instincts of a cornered animal. Richard realized that Bradley was no longer an asset. Bradley was a catastrophic liability, a heavy iron anchor tied securely around Richard's neck, dragging him straight down to the bottom of the ocean. Richard took a deliberate step away from his son, physically distancing himself from the toxic fallout of the recorded confession. He turned his back on Bradley, completely ignoring the frantic, terrified pleading in his son's wide eyes. Richard adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo jacket, forcing his shoulders to relax, and walked slowly toward me. He pasted on a smile that was so incredibly grotesque, so completely devoid of genuine human emotion, that it made the skin on my arms crawl. "Penny, honey," Richard said, his voice dropping into a soft, sickeningly gentle cadence that he had never once used with me in my entire life. "Send him to jail." The entire ballroom gasped collectively, a sharp intake of breath from hundreds of guests, witnessing a father publicly offer his own son up for slaughter. Bradley let out a strangled, choked noise, stumbling backward against a cocktail table as if his father had just driven a physical blade directly into his chest. "Take everything from him," Richard continued, stepping closer to me, his eyes wide with a desperate manic gleam. "He deserves it. He ruined this company. He went behind my back, he forged my name, and he destroyed what I built. But you and I, we can fix this. We can run Rhodes Resorts together. You can be my co-CEO. We will rebrand the entire portfolio. We will rebuild the trust. I will finally give you the validation you always wanted, Penny. You proved you are a Rhodes today. You proved you are just like me." I stared at the man who had sired me, listening to the absolute peak of his narcissistic delusion. He honestly believed I had spent the last decade working grueling hours building a billion-dollar private equity firm, buying up his toxic debt, and cornering him in a room full of federal agents, all because I was a sad, lonely little girl desperate for his approval. He genuinely believed that a seat next to him at a bankrupt table was the ultimate prize in the universe. I let out a laugh. It was a cold, hard, echoing sound that sliced cleanly through the heavy tension in the ballroom. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of profound, absolute finality. "You think I want to co-run a bankrupt shell with you?" I asked, my voice ringing out clear and sharp, ensuring every investor in the room heard my rejection. "You think I want to attach my pristine corporate reputation to a man who spent 30 years telling me I was completely useless? You looked me in the eyes when I was 18 years old, Richard, and you told me I was genetically unsuited for business. You told me my only value to this family would be marrying a wealthy man who could tolerate my defiant personality." Richard's fake smile faltered, his jaw twitching violently as his own cruel words were broadcast back to him in front of his wealthy peers. "I do not need your validation, Richard," I said, stepping right into his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. "I have my own. I have an empire that generates more profit in a single quarter than Rhodes Resorts generated in its best decade. I did not buy your debt to partner with you. I bought it to liquidate you. I am going to tear this company down to the studs, sell off the remaining assets, and build something entirely new over the ashes of your precious legacy." Before Richard could attempt another pathetic negotiation, Governor Davis stepped confidently past the line of local police officers securing the floor. He walked directly up the stage steps, his imposing presence commanding absolute silence from the panicked crowd. He did not ask for permission. He simply took the microphone from the stand, holding it with a firm, uncompromising grip. He looked down at my father with an expression of sheer governmental authority. "Richard, Governor Davis," said, his voice booming through the surround sound system, leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. "Not only is your company completely bankrupt, but due to the overwhelming embezzlement evidence Ms. Rhodes and her firm have uncovered and provided to my office, the state is taking immediate action." The governor paused, looking across the sea of frantic investors, board members, and politicians. "Effective immediately, the state is officially revoking your gaming and hospitality licenses," the governor announced. "Every single casino, every single hotel bar, and every single entertainment venue operating under the Rhodes Resorts banner is hereby suspended, pending a full federal investigation. Your doors are closed. Your legacy is over, Richard. You are entirely finished in this state." The ballroom erupted into sheer, unadulterated chaos. Losing the gaming and hospitality licenses was the ultimate death sentence for a resort empire. A luxury hotel cannot function without the ability to operate its casinos and serve its guests. The board members began shouting at one another, their faces pale with terror. Investors were practically running toward the main exits, desperately trying to get on the phone with their brokers and legal teams to mitigate their massive impending financial losses. The SEC agents moved in closer, forming a tight, inescapable perimeter around my father and my brother. Richard collapsed heavily onto his knees, the expensive fabric of his trousers tearing against the marble floor. His hands covered his face as the reality of his total annihilation finally broke his spirit. The great, terrifying titan of Boston hospitality was currently sobbing on the floor of a ballroom he no longer owned, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity. Amidst the screaming crowd and the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the massive windows, my eyes fell upon Jasmine. She had backed away from Bradley, pressing her spine tightly against a decorative marble pillar. The flawless, haughty influencer facade had completely melted away. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly out of place, and her chest was heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. She looked at her husband, who was currently being cornered by two stern federal agents, asking him to step forward and place his hands behind his back. She looked at her father-in-law crying pathetically on the floor. Then she looked down at her own hands, staring intensely at the glittering diamond rings purchased with stolen pension funds. Jasmine was not a brilliant businesswoman, but she possessed a terrifying innate sense of self-preservation. The reality of the financial documents displayed on the projectors was finally clicking into place in her mind. She suddenly realized that the shell company holding the $2.4 million of stolen retirement money was registered entirely in her name. Bradley had not just bought her a house. He had set her up as the perfect legally binding fall guy. If she did nothing, the federal government would seize her assets, freeze her bank accounts, and drag her out of this hotel in handcuffs right alongside her husband. She would lose her brand, her millions of followers, and her freedom. I watched the sheer terror in her eyes shift into something cold hard and incredibly ruthless. The panic evaporated, replaced instantly by a shark-like calculation. She straightened her posture, smoothing the fabric of her ruined sequined dress with trembling but determined hands. She was not going to go down with the Rhodes family ship. She was going to ensure she was the only one who made it to a lifeboat, no matter who she had to drown to get there. Jasmine locked eyes with the lead federal investigator standing near Bradley. She reached into her designer clutch, pulling out her smartphone, and began walking directly toward the authorities, ready to make the most vicious, desperate move of her entire life to save her own skin. I did not move a single muscle as Jasmine closed the distance between herself and the lead federal investigator. Bradley, still cornered by the agents and panting heavily, saw his wife approaching through the chaos. A fleeting look of pathetic, desperate hope washed over his sweating face. He actually thought she was coming to defend him. He believed that his beautiful, loyal influencer wife was going to stand by her man in his darkest hour. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers grasping desperately at the shimmering fabric of her designer gown. Jasmine did not just pull away. She violently shoved him backward. Both of her manicured hands slammed into his chest with enough force to send him stumbling awkwardly into the SEC agent standing directly behind him. "Do not touch me," Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings and cutting through the murmurs of the panicked crowd. She turned her back on her husband, entirely severing their marital bond in a fraction of a second, and thrust her smartphone directly toward the lead investigator. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this. He lied to me. He forced me to sign the incorporation documents for those shell companies. He told me it was standard tax procedure for brand sponsorships. I am completely innocent." Bradley gasped, his jaw dropping open in utter disbelief. "Jasmine, what are you doing? Shut your mouth right now." She ignored him completely, her survival instincts brutally overriding any loyalty she had ever pretended to possess. "He has an offshore account." She blurted out, her words tumbling over each other in her frantic rush to secure her own safety. "It is registered in the Cayman Islands under a corporate proxy. He has been funneling the stolen pension money there for 6 months to hide it from the resort accountants. I have the login credentials right here on my phone. I will give you the exact account numbers, the routing sequences, the passwords, everything you need if you grant me full federal immunity right now." The ballroom erupted into a secondary frenzy of shocked gasps. The sheer ruthless speed of her betrayal was staggering even to the seasoned investigators. The lead SEC agent did not hesitate. He signaled to a junior agent who immediately stepped forward to take custody of Jasmine's phone, sliding the device carefully into a clear plastic evidence bag. That was the final absolute breaking point for Bradley. The golden child, the untouchable heir who had never faced a single consequence in his entire privileged life, completely snapped. A raw, animalistic scream ripped from his throat. He threw his weight forward, breaking past the agent behind him, lunging directly at his wife with his hands outstretched like claws. "You gold-digging traitor!" Bradley roared, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "You spent half of that stolen money on your fake Instagram life. You begged for that Aspen villa. You drained the corporate credit cards to buy designer bags and charter private jets just so you could pretend you were better than everyone else. You knew exactly where that cash was coming from. You are just as guilty as I am." He never reached her. The police officers reacted with lightning brutal efficiency. 3 uniformed officers converged on him instantly. One officer grabbed Bradley by the shoulder, spinning him around with forceful momentum, while another swept his legs out from under him. The sound of Bradley hitting the polished marble floor was a heavy, incredibly satisfying thud. The custom tailoring of his $5,000 tuxedo ripped violently at the shoulder seam as the officers pinned him face down against the cold, unforgiving stone. "Stop resisting!" a commanding voice shouted over the chaotic din of the ballroom. Bradley thrashed wildly, screaming profanities at his wife, his father, and the officers holding him down. He kicked his legs and twisted his torso, throwing a massive tantrum like a spoiled toddler denied a toy. But his resistance was entirely futile against the trained officers. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed with absolute finality across the room. The golden boy of the Rhodes Empire was officially shackled, his face pressed aggressively against the floor, his pristine image destroyed forever. Jasmine took a shaky step backward, pressing her hand against her chest, as she watched her husband get completely subdued. She let out a long, shuddering breath, a small, triumphant smirk beginning to form on her perfectly painted lips. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully played the victim, offered up the sacrificial lamb, and secured her permanent escape route. I walked slowly across the dance floor, my heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the marble, until I stood directly in front of her. Jasmine looked up, her smug expression faltering instantly as she met my cold, unwavering gaze. "Funny how quickly loyalty vanishes when the money dries up," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute victory. Jasmine narrowed her eyes, trying desperately to maintain her haughty composure. "I was a victim of his systemic fraud, Penelope. I had no idea what he was doing behind closed doors. I am a brand ambassador, not a financial auditor." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Do you remember the country club gala 3 years ago, Jasmine? You cornered me near the open bar, surrounded by all of your vapid social climbing friends. You looked at my tailored business suit, laughed right in my face, and told me I would never find a man because I was far too focused on my spreadsheets. You said I was destined to be a miserable, lonely spinster, while you lived a beautiful fairy tale life funded by a real man who knew how to provide." Jasmine swallowed hard, the memory clearly flashing behind her panicked eyes. She took another step back, but there was nowhere left for her to run. The SEC agents were standing just a few feet away, securing the area and listening to every single word. Well, I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a razor-sharp whisper. "My spreadsheets just put your husband in handcuffs. And once the federal prosecutors finish tracing the wire transfers to those shell companies you happily signed off on, they will be coming for those diamond rings on your fingers. Enjoy your temporary immunity, Jasmine. You are going to need it when you are living in a tiny studio apartment trying to figure out how to pay for your own groceries without a stolen corporate credit card." Her face drained of all remaining color. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish suffocating on dry land. The realization that her wealthy, untouchable lifestyle was permanently gone finally hit her with the force of a freight train. I turned my back on her without a second thought, completely dismissing her existence. She was no longer a threat. She was just another pathetic casualty of the empire's collapse. The scene behind me was a masterpiece of absolute poetic devastation. Patricia had thrown herself onto the marble floor right next to where the officers were holding Bradley. She was on her knees wailing hysterically, her hands reaching out to frantically grab at her son's handcuffed wrists. The officers repeatedly and firmly instructed her to step back, but she ignored them, sobbing loudly about how her beautiful, brilliant boy was being treated like a common street criminal. She weaponized her tears looking around at the remaining guests, desperately seeking someone, anyone to intervene and save her perfect family. No one moved a single inch to help her. A few feet away, Richard was aggressively hyperventilating. He had collapsed heavily into one of the velvet banquet chairs, clutching his chest as his lungs fought for air. The reality of losing his company, his political connections, his gaming licenses, his personal estate, and his legacy all in the span of 30 minutes had completely broken his mind. He stared blankly at the ceiling, muttering incoherent sentences to himself, entirely unresponsive to the flashing police lights and the chaos swirling around him. The remaining party guests, the elite politicians, the wealthy investors, and the high society socialites were fleeing the ballroom as if the building were actively burning to the ground. But they were not just running away. They were holding up their smartphones. The rapid flash of camera lights illuminated the room as dozens of people recorded the magnificent, irreversible downfall of the Rhodes family. High society thrived on gossip, and this was the scandal of the decade. By morning, the video of Bradley screaming in handcuffs and Richard gasping for air would be plastered across every major news network and financial blog in the country. The social execution was absolute. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I stood in the center of the wreckage, my posture perfectly straight, my mind incredibly clear. The toxic, abusive chain that had suffocated me for my entire life was finally broken. I had excised the infection completely. I turned my attention away from my ruined family, letting their screams fade into the background noise. My eyes scanned the edges of the ballroom, cutting through the fleeing crowd until I found exactly who I was looking for. Standing near the kitchen double doors, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the hotel. He was clutching a silver clipboard tightly to his chest, his face pale and completely terrified as he watched his former bosses being dismantled by federal authorities. I smoothed the fabric of my silk gown, adjusted my posture to project absolute, unwavering authority, and began walking directly toward him. The era of Richard and Bradley Rhodes was officially over. It was time for the new owner to assume command. Mr. Sterling looked as though he wanted the polished marble floor to split open and swallow him whole. As I closed the distance between us, his grip on his silver clipboard tightened until his knuckles turned completely white. He had spent the last decade taking orders from a family that viewed him and his staff as entirely expendable. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy, clearly expecting me to demand his immediate resignation right there in the middle of the chaos. Instead, I stopped 2 feet in front of him and offered a calm, professional smile. "Mr. Sterling, as the new owner of this property, I am officially shutting down this event," I stated, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the surrounding staff. "Please inform the catering staff that they will receive double their pay tonight as a bonus from Apex Holdings. Furthermore, assure every single employee in this building that their stolen pension funds will be entirely replenished by my firm by Monday morning." A waiter standing a few feet away dropped a silver tray of champagne flutes. The loud echoing clatter masked the sound of his sharp gasp. Absolute relief washed over the faces of the staff members hovering near the kitchen doors. Some covered their mouths with their hands, while others slumped against the walls, tears of profound gratitude welling in their eyes. For weeks, they had lived in silent terror, knowing their retirement savings had vanished. In less than a minute, I had restored their futures. Mr. Sterling let out a massive, shaky breath, his posture instantly transforming from terrified submission to absolute dedicated loyalty. He nodded frantically, immediately turning to his staff to relay the orders. I turned my back on the kitchen doors and faced the smoking crater of my former family. The local police officers hauled Bradley roughly to his feet. He was spitting vicious curses, his face smeared with dirt from the floor, and his expensive tuxedo torn at the shoulder. He thrashed against the officer's iron grip, but they easily overpowered him, dragging him backward toward the grand entrance. I looked at the remaining trio of miserable broken people. "Bradley is going to federal prison," I announced, my voice slicing through the lingering murmurs of the room. "The Golden Boy is going to spend the next decade wearing a jumpsuit instead of a bespoke suit." I shifted my gaze to my sister-in-law, who was currently watching an SEC agent seal her smartphone into a clear plastic evidence bag. "Jasmine, the SEC will be seizing your assets, including your designer wardrobe, by tomorrow morning," I stated with absolute unwavering finality. "Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards will bounce. That fabulous Aspen villa you could not stop bragging about is currently being seized as federal evidence. You have absolutely nothing left to post on the internet." Jasmine let out a high-pitched, strangled cry. She lunged forward, her hands grasping desperately at the air as if she could physically catch the wealth evaporating around her. But the federal agents immediately stepped into her path, crossing their arms and blocking her movement. She shrank back, her haughty influencer persona entirely destroyed, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, penniless accessory to corporate fraud. I turned my eyes to the two people who had orchestrated my lifetime of misery. And Mom, Dad. I continued, letting the cold reality of their situation sink in deeply. "Since Bradley forged your signature on the collateral, your mansion now belongs to the bank. You have exactly 0 assets." Patricia's face contorted into a mask of pure, hideous rage. The manufactured maternal love she had tried to weaponize just moments ago completely evaporated. She dropped the angelic act, her features twisting into the familiar vicious sneer I had endured my entire childhood. "You ungrateful, malicious wretch!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandeliers. "After everything we gave you, this is how you repay us. You are stealing our home. You are putting your own mother out in the cold." "I did not steal a single thing, Patricia," I replied smoothly, completely unaffected by her tantrum. "Your precious golden boy handed your estate away to loan sharks on a silver platter because you raised him to believe the rules did not apply to him. You spent 30 years enabling his arrogance, and this is your return on investment." Richard finally snapped out of his hyperventilating stupor. He dragged himself up from the velvet banquet chair, his legs shaking violently beneath him. He looked around the ballroom, seeing the federal agents packing up hard drives from the audio-visual booth, the police officers securing the exits, and the total undeniable end of his lifelong reign. The realization that he was currently a homeless, bankrupt fraud hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled toward me, holding his hands out in a pathetic, agonizing gesture of pure submission. "Penny, where are we supposed to go tonight?" Richard begged, his voice trembling and weak. He looked like a fragile, terrified old man. "You cannot put your own parents on the street." He actually thought his title as my father would save him. He actually thought that after a lifetime of telling me I was worthless, he could invoke the sacred bond of family to secure a luxury hotel suite for the night. I stared at the man who had banished me from his life simply because I refused to be his obedient puppet. I let the silence stretch for a single heavy beat, savoring the absolute shift in power. "Try an Uber," I said, my voice dripping with pure freezing ice. "I hear there is a Motel 6 down by the highway." Richard gasped, clutching his chest, as if the words physically wounded him. Patricia let out another theatrical wail, stomping her heel against the marble floor. I ignored their pathetic displays and turned my head toward the security team hovering near the stage. They were the exact same men who just an hour ago were ready to throw me out into the cold at Richard's command. Now they stood at strict attention, waiting for my directive. They knew exactly who signed their paychecks. "Security, please escort these trespassers off my property," I commanded, gesturing dismissively toward my parents and Jasmine. "They do not belong here." The guards did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They moved forward with immediate, unquestioning military precision. Two large men grabbed Richard tightly by the arms, hoisting him forward as his knees completely gave out. Another guard stepped directly into Patricia's path, pointing a stern finger toward the back of the room, forcing her to walk. Jasmine was already being herded forward by the SEC agents, her head hung low in total defeat. But they were not marched out through the grand entrance with the remaining fleeing guests. The security guards guided Richard, Patricia, and Jasmine directly toward the swinging doors of the kitchen, marching the former royalty of Boston high society straight out through the dingy concrete service elevator. It was the ultimate poetic eviction. I stood completely alone in the center of the massive ballroom. The flashing police lights eventually faded from the windows. The screaming died away. The room fell entirely silent, save for the soft clinking of the catering staff clearing away the discarded champagne glasses. I looked up at the crystal chandeliers glowing warmly overhead. The heavy, toxic chain that had suffocated my entire existence was finally broken. I took a deep, steadying breath of the quiet air, feeling the profound, undeniable rush of absolute freedom. The morning sun broke across the Boston skyline, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the absolute wreckage of the Rhodes family legacy. I stood in front of the massive flat-screen television in what used to be my father's private executive office, watching the financial news networks dissect the carnage with ruthless precision. Every single channel was running the exact same story, their bottom chyrons flashing in bold, urgent red letters. Rhodes' empire crumbles, sister buys out bankrupt brother. The talking heads were absolutely mesmerized by the sheer brutality of the corporate takeover. They debated the legal implications, marveled at the strategic brilliance of Apex Holdings acquiring the toxic debt, and detailed the massive embezzlement charges currently pending against the former golden boy of Boston hospitality. The media fed on the scandal like starving wolves. It was a flawless public execution of a dynasty that had spent decades pretending to be untouchable. I muted the television, shifting my attention to the tablet resting on my newly installed mahogany desk. The corporate destruction was deeply satisfying, but the personal fallout was providing an entirely different level of entertainment. Jasmine was currently live streaming to her millions of followers, though that number was actively plummeting by the second. She was sitting on the floor of a sparsely furnished hotel room, attempting to execute the classic influencer apology tour. She wore no makeup, her hair was deliberately messy, and she was dressed in a plain, oversized gray sweatshirt to convey maximum vulnerability. She stared into the camera, forcing her eyes to well up with tears, as she delivered a scripted, pathetic monologue about how she had been manipulated, lied to, and financially abused by her own husband. She claimed she was just a naive girl who trusted the wrong man and begged her audience for grace during this incredibly dark and painful chapter of her life. It was a magnificent performance completely devoid of any actual human truth. And the internet was absolutely destroying her for it. I watched the live comment feed scrolling past her tear-stained face at lightning speed. Her followers were not buying a single word of the victim narrative. They were mercilessly roasting her, dropping links to the SEC press releases and calculating the exact cost of the stolen pension funds she had worn on her fingers. Comment after comment demanded to know how she could be blind to millions of dollars being funneled into offshore shell companies registered entirely in her own name. Major cosmetics brands and luxury fashion labels were publicly terminating her sponsorship contracts, in the live chat legally distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of federal fraud. Jasmine's eyes darted frantically as she read the incoming absolute hatred. The fake tears stopped. Her facade cracked, revealing the raw, unadulterated panic of a woman watching her entire identity evaporate into nothingness. She abruptly ended the broadcast, plunging the screen into black. Her digital empire was dead. Bradley was faring infinitely worse in the physical world. While Jasmine was crying on the internet, my brother was standing in a federal courtroom shackled at the wrists and ankles. My legal team had sent over the court transcripts just an hour ago. The golden child who had spent his entire life wearing custom Italian suits and laughing off consequences was forced to stand before a federal judge wearing a harsh fluorescent orange jumpsuit. He had looked around the courtroom, desperately searching for the high-priced defense attorneys my father usually kept on retainer, only to realize that the family accounts were entirely frozen. He was represented by an exhausted public defender who had met him exactly 10 minutes prior to the arraignment. When the prosecution presented the evidence of the Cayman Islands accounts, the shell companies, and the forged collateral documents, the judge did not even hesitate. Bradley was deemed a massive, undeniable flight risk. Bail was categorically denied. The man who had been groomed to inherit the world was ordered to be remanded to federal custody pending trial. He was going to federal prison, and there was absolutely no amount of parental influence or corporate money left to save him. He would spend the next decade locked in a concrete cell, stripped of his name, his wealth, and his freedom. But the most poetic justice of the entire morning belonged to my parents. I picked up my coffee cup, taking a slow, savoring sip as I reviewed the security report detailing their ultimate eviction. When the bank executives realized the severity of Bradley's fraud and verified that my father's signature on the massive collateral loans was a complete forgery, they moved with unprecedented speed. The sprawling, opulent mansion that Richard and Patricia had lorded over for 30 years was seized before the sun even came up. My parents had been forced to pack their meager, legally permitted personal belongings into heavy black garbage bags under the strict supervision of armed bank security. They were stripped of their luxury vehicles, their frozen credit cards, and their dignity. The report detailed how they were currently moving those black garbage bags into a cheap, rundown rental unit. It was a squalid Motel 6 located directly beside a roaring interstate highway, the kind of place with flickering neon signs, peeling linoleum floors, and the permanent stench of stale cigarette smoke and despair. I could picture Patricia sitting on a sagging, stained mattress, clutching the single designer handbag she had managed to sneak past the auditors, sobbing hysterically over the chipped Formica countertops. I could picture Richard staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, his hands shaking, as he realized his smartphone was entirely useless. Every single politician, investor, and high society friend he tried to call was sending him straight to voicemail. They were social pariahs, completely exiled from the elite circles they had spent their entire lives clawing their way into. They had exactly 0 assets, 0 allies, and 0 hope. They were finally experiencing the exact same cold, ruthless rejection they had inflicted upon me when I was 18 years old. I set my coffee cup down and walked away from the desk, moving toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of the top-floor executive suite. The hotel was currently undergoing a massive, rapid rebranding. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the old regime was being physically ripped out of the building. Down below on the street level, a massive construction crane was blocking the main entrance. Sparks showered down like aggressive fireworks as a team of workers used heavy blowtorches to sever the thick steel bolts holding the giant, gaudy Rhodes nameplate to the building's facade. I watched with profound satisfaction as the massive metal letters groaned detached from the stone and plummeted heavily toward the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust as they hit the pavement. They were immediately hauled away as scrap metal. In their place, the crane hoisted a crisp, sleek, modern sign into the morning air. The letters caught the sunlight brilliantly as they were bolted firmly into the stone. Apex Grand. The new era had officially arrived. The heavy oak doors of my suite swung open, breaking the quiet hum of the room. Governor Davis stepped inside, bypassing my newly hired executive assistant with a wave of his hand. He did not ask for an appointment. He simply walked into the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes surveying the sleek minimalist upgrades I had already implemented in the office. He looked at the empty space where my father's massive ego-driven oil portraits used to hang and offered a small, approving nod. "Good morning, Governor," I said, turning away from the window to face him. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this unannounced visit?" Governor Davis offered a tight, professional smile. "I came to personally thank you, Penelope. Your complete cooperation with the SEC and the state investigators overnight was unprecedented. You handed us the entire fraudulent network on a silver platter. Because of your firm's immediate capital injection and your guarantee to restore the stolen pension funds, we avoided a massive, catastrophic economic fallout. You saved hundreds of local jobs at this hotel, and you stabilized a market that was 30 minutes away from a total panic." I walked over to the sleek crystal decanter resting on the side table. "It is simply good business, Governor. Apex Holdings does not acquire distressed assets to watch them burn. We acquire them to rebuild them correctly. We are fully committed to ensuring the Apex Grand becomes the premier hospitality destination in this state, operating with complete financial transparency and absolute integrity. The governor watched me carefully, his expression shifting from professional gratitude to deep, calculated respect. He stepped closer, dropping the political persona for a brief, genuine moment of candor. "You played a dangerous game," Penelope, the governor, said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant timbre. "Orchestrating the buyout of the toxic debt, cornering your brother into a public confession, and aligning the federal raid perfectly with the anniversary gala. The sheer margin for error was massive. One wrong move, and you could have been dragged down into the bankruptcy right alongside your father. But you executed it flawlessly. It was the most ruthless, brilliant corporate maneuvering I have ever witnessed in my entire career." I picked up the crystal decanter, the heavy glass cool and solid against my palm. I poured 2 generous measures of expensive aged scotch into a pair of heavy tumbler glasses. I handed one to the governor, holding my own glass up toward the sunlight streaming through the massive windows. The amber liquid caught the light, glowing with quiet, undeniable power. I looked the governor directly in the eyes, my posture perfectly straight, my voice carrying the absolute, unshakable confidence of a woman who had fought her way out of hell and conquered the world. "I did not play a game, Governor," I said quietly, the words ringing with absolute final truth. "I just stopped letting them play me." The governor held my gaze for a long moment, a slow, deep smile of profound respect spreading across his weathered face. He raised his glass in a silent, meaningful salute to the new sovereign of the city and took a slow drink of the scotch. I turned back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful city skyline. The streets below were bustling with life, the morning traffic moving in rhythmic patterns, the world completely unaware of the massive shift in power that had occurred in the shadows. I was no longer the genetic disappointment. I was no longer the useless daughter, the lonely spinster, or the discarded scapegoat meant to be hidden away and forgotten. I had taken the absolute worst of their cruelty, their greed, and their abuse, and I had forged it into an unbreakable weapon. I had burned their rotten legacy to the ground and built a fortress upon the ashes. I was the sole, undisputed architect of my own empire. I took a slow, savoring sip of the burning scotch, letting the warmth settle deep into my chest. The sunlight washed over my face, bright and full of endless, infinite possibility. The screen fades to black on my calm, completely satisfied smile.